Hello, everybody. Francois Ward here. I'm an engineering manager who focuses mostly on front end technologies as well as software platforms. This is part 4 of a retrospective where we're looking at answering the memes on the front end ecosystem. Is it true that you have to always chase the latest and greatest and upgrade your apps all the time? So by now, if you watch the other videos, you know the drills, but for those just joining us, there's a blog post that we're following, one that I wrote 5 years ago to make sure that I'm not looking at the past with rose-tinted glasses and bias. You can find the link below, but I'll also be showing some screenshots along the way. In this video in particular, we're going to be going over dependency managements as well as module systems, linting and code formatting, how to keep things consistent, as well as languages, the compilers that you should be using, and we're also going to look at type systems. Once again, an obligatory warning, we're going to be looking at a lot of technologies. I can't be up to date or an expert on everything, even though I did try to do my research before recording the video. If your experience differs or I'm downright wrong, please feel free to share your experience in the comments below. And on that note, let's get started. Dependency management and module systems. Well, let's keep things simple here. In 2016, not everybody was convinced that NPM packages, NPM modules was the way to go and build apps. There were still debates about how to organize code. Bower, which was more meant for the web, still had some mindshare, and some folks were clinging to it. And on the module system side, many frameworks like Angular had their own, and modules like AMDs were still kind of around. A big problem with CommonJS was that it was really meant for Node and for running on the server, but browsers work in a more asynchronous way. So the fact that CommonJS modules kind of assumed they were evaluated synchronously, the way the syntax worked, meant that you really needed a build step to make them work in a browser. And not every team, not every company used a bundler or used a build step in their JavaScript build pipeline. ES6 modules were new. They were not really well understood, and for all practical purpose were generally used as syntax sugar over CommonJS. Still, it felt like it was the way the industry was going to go. NPM packages, CommonJS modules, and eventually ES6 modules. One gotcha that I had addressed was that using NPM packages for a web app was kind of tricky. Making your NPM installs deterministic was rough in 2016. NPM very much used the semver notations that you put in your package JSON, which meant that your packages could change every time you install them or change between your local and your build pipeline. There was something called a shrink wrap that you could do, but in my experience, it was really buggy and really hard to get to work, to the point that Huber had published a kind of a version of a script that allowed you to confirm if it was set up correctly. Now, again, today, things did go that route. We are generally using NPM and ES6 modules, but things are a little bit more polished. Not only we have NPM and we are using the NPM registry, there are multiple clients for it. Yarn came out and it added better ways to do that shrink wrap with lock files, which eventually got adopted by NPM. It also promised much better speed, which kind of shook up that ecosystem. And now it's pretty much expected that these package managers have to be fairly fast. So, what's the verdict in 2021? Well, again, I'm repeating myself. NPM, ES6 modules. Between Yarn or NPM as the client or other package managers like PNPM, I find them fairly interchangeable. I use Yarn myself, really doesn't matter. They mostly all have parity, feature parity on each other. Pick whichever one you know. And the alternatives and other module systems, pretty much gone. Linting and code quality. So that one makes me chuckle because it's the place where I changed a lot in the way I handle teams. I used to really feel you needed the strictest code standards possible, and you had to enforce them with linting and tools and crank it up to 11. Got a lot of people mad at me back in the days, to be honest. So if you remember the linting space in 2016, there were a lot of lint or hint tools. There was JSLint, JSHint, JSCS, ESLint, and there was a tool called Standard too that was not really standard and was pretty divisive because of its stance on semicolons. Now, some of these tools focused more on actual linting, catching errors in your code base, and some focused more on the formatting. Eventually, ESLint kind of came out on top by merging with some of these and making kind of one tool to rule them all. And that's really what it became. ESLint was the standard, and you could do pretty much everything with it. There were so many rules that you either spend a lot of time with your team debating which ones to use, or you used a preset. And a really popular preset was the one from Airbnb. It was well documented, it was really strict, which I loved at the time. But a lot of folks felt it was just too much. You could almost not code without flagging errors left and right, and it was pretty restrictive. Still, I felt it was state of the art, and so I recommended using ESLint with Airbnb. The last thing I want to do is argue with my team on which rules to use, and so differing it to an external entity was a great solution for that. But these days, we have something better, prettier. Prettier has been pretty much game changing. It's a tool that you just run on your code base and it rewrites essentially your entire code with a very standard set of formatting rules. It makes it that two people can write the same code, format it completely differently, but by the time you check it in, it's all going to be standardized. It's wonderful. Even better, there's much fewer configuration in Prettier as opposed to something like ESLint. And that means less stuff to argue about. Though there's still a lot of pretty heated discussions, especially around things like line length. When it came out a couple of years ago, the hardest part, though, was to get people to just agree to use it. Turns out folks have really strong opinions about how to format their code. And back then, people really felt that they could add value to their code base by manually formatting it. Fortunately, these days, prettier is commonly accepted, and now most code bases I see use it. So, what's the verdict? Well, if you use ESLint with Airbnb 5 years ago, that was pretty state of the art. Today, though, ESLint plus Prettier. Let Prettier handle everything related to formatting and style, and use ESLint exclusively for catching bugs. Something I really like to do is just use ESLint as a preset called ESLint recommended. Use that, then use Prettier with the default settings. Even if you don't like the styles, it just doesn't matter. Now you no longer have to worry about it. Write your code however you want. And ESLint will just take care of catching bugs and eventually maybe the type system too. Oh, and for the love of everything, don't use ESLint to sort your imports. That's stylistic, and that's no longer really how you should use ESLint, in my opinion. And also, it can introduce bugs because sometimes sort order matters. It shouldn't, but it does. And having proper sorting rules for imports is really complicated. It's not worth it. Languages, compilers, and type system. To TypeScript or not to TypeScript? That is the big question these days. In 2016, you had a couple of options. You could stick with ES5. ES6 was still new. Not everybody knew it. Not everybody felt they needed it. Generally, it was done through Babel, the compiler, which at the time I think was called 526. You also had type systems. You had Flow by Facebook, which was focusing a lot more on code correctness and catching bugs, and you had TypeScript, which was a bit more polished in terms of developer experience. Oh, and CoffeeScript was still used a bunch. With ES6 compilers becoming good and folks accepting more and more that they should have a build step in their JavaScript build pipeline, it had most of the good parts of CoffeeScript without the bad. I really felt that you had a slam dunk using ES6 with Babel. There was still the questions of should you use types, and here there was a conundrum for me. By the way, like as a disclaimer, I'm formerly a C sharp developer. I've done a lot of Java, and I'm pretty familiar with more advanced type systems in Elm, ML, or even Haskell. But in JavaScript, it seemed like it was a bit more nuanced. Flow, while it was great on the correctness front, was maybe a bit hard to use. Its error messages were hard to follow. It worked really well with ESX and React coming from Facebook, but it was really difficult to use on Windows. About 50% of front-end devs still use Windows. Not everybody's on a Mac. Its tooling and types ecosystem were kind of lacking. On the other hand, TypeScript was missing a lot of features I felt was necessary to make it worth the investment. For example, it didn't support strict null at the time, strict null being a way for type systems to make the difference between when a value can be null or cannot. And that's where, in my experience, most of the bugs come from. TypeScript also pushed people to write JavaScript kind of like they would C sharp or Java. And that was not really per the language. I don't know if it was the community, the documentation, but a lot of TypeScript code bases inevitably ended up with heavy usage of classes and inheritance and classic object oriented programming, which, in my opinion, is not the best way to build JavaScript applications. With third party types and libraries also being a mess in both cases, especially in Flow, I just didn't feel the trade off was worth it. And holy cow, at the time, did I take a lot of heat for that. Folks felt I didn't know what I was talking about. They thought I didn't understand TypeScript and stuff. But in practice, in the wild, I saw a lot of people struggling. Like setting up TypeScript can be hard. The infrastructure can be difficult to get right. And even amongst people who are really familiar with type systems, learning this kind of hybrid where TypeScript is kind of more of a linter and does not make real runtime guarantees really confuse folks. And let's be honest here, I feel especially back then TypeScript fans were little rabid. Anyway, as expected in 2021, things evolved a lot. TypeScript now has all the features I've wanted and then some. And now people who use it generally understand that JavaScript is not C sharp, it's not Java, and use TypeScript to really enhance their code bases. I still stand though with what I said back then that at the time ES6 with Babel was the way to go. I still feel like today there's certain type of maybe smaller projects or node specific projects or libraries are better done in pure ES6 where you can maybe avoid a build step altogether and get going a lot faster. But for a lot of projects, especially the ones that you'll be working on in your team for a company with a lot of people working in them, like TypeScript is really the way to go. I still don't think it's the slam dunk that people make it seem to be with no drawbacks. You still have to deal with poor third party typings. You still have to set up that infrastructure. And again, like no two project is the same, so I don't think it's a really understood problems. But these days, the benefits really outweigh the drawbacks. One way that I really like to set things up is using Babel to strip the TypeScript types and just using TypeScript, the compiler, as a super linter, or at least just to handle the type checking. I am curious, however, where the JavaScript compilation world is going to go. Right before recording this video, I saw on Twitter how the Next.js community is looking at integrating a compiler built in Rust called SWC that's promised to be a lot faster. So I'm going to be keeping an eye on that and see where that goes. Though I never really felt like the time it takes to compile the JavaScript is a really significant part of my build pipelines, but still, we'll see what they do with it. It's really hard to give up the Babel plugin ecosystems. And that's it for the fourth part of the retrospective. Hopefully, I don't get nearly as much heat for this one, in my opinion, on TypeScript as I did back in the days. So, what about you? Are you still seeing people struggle with type systems in JavaScript? Are you having issues introducing prettier in your code base? Let me know. Leave a comment. So, we're almost done. In the next one, we're going to be going over application lifecycle, or really state management, as well as the core libraries or framework. You probably have a pretty good idea of where that's going to go, though. After that, we're going to make one more video to tally up the result and finally answer the big question. Is the JavaScript ecosystem as wild as people say it is? Well, thank you for watching, and see you then.